So we are 42 days away, maybe 41 if you're seeing this a little bit late. But we are really entering the final stretch of it. And the wonderful news that we were all looking forward to is that it is just as close and impossible to pick as it has been pretty much for the past month and a half. If I'm being totally honest, this video is just my excuse to talk about polling data and see where we are across all the states and nationally. And it also gives me an excuse to show you a tool that I think is really important when it comes to like visualizing that, and that is how The Economist portrays like polling data, which I thought was really, really interesting. So this graphic here basically shows you how both candidates are doing polling nationally and what the assumed margin of error is for them. Now, I've talked about this a little bit before, but just want to stress that the popular vote is not what matters in a presidential election, but it does have relevance. For example, if you're winning the popular vote by like 4 points, it starts to become mathematically impossible that you won't also win the Electoral College. So the point of like looking at stuff like this is that you get a sense for how likely it is sort of for one of the parties to win. For the Democrats to be absolute favorites in an election, they need to be between like 3 to 4 points ahead nationally of where the Republicans are. So if Trump is getting 46% of the vote, Harris really needs to be hitting high 49 up into like 50% range to really have it locked in that she's going to win this thing. And I think this here is a good tool. Now, this is not showing you like those middle numbers there, the median, that is not like the average that they're polling. That is just like what the middle poll is for those candidates. So what you're actually seeing there is a range that is factoring in the margin of error and assuming what a candidate's floor and like a candidate's ceiling are for how terribly or how well they'll perform. So Trump's floor here, as projected by The Economist, is 45.5% roughly, with his ceiling being 47 and a bit. In his last previous two elections, he's gotten in the 46% range. I believe 46.1 in 2016 and 46.8 in 2020. So that makes sense, and that's the best he's ever polled in any of his races for president. So seemingly the worst that Harris is going to do is 49.5 roughly, a little bit less, and the best she could do is pretty much on par with what Joe Biden got in 2020. The scenarios this points out is, well, if we assume that the margin of error here is entirely to Trump's benefit, that he outperforms the last two elections, passes 47%, and then Harris has numbers a bit more similar to Hillary Clinton than to Joe Biden, then Harris is only 2.2 points ahead, which is anyone's race. That is like a similar margin to how well Hillary Clinton did over Trump in 2016. So anyone's game at that point, really. Democrats a slight favorite, but not enough to like just start celebrating now. If the median of these polls is correct, just like the middle sample from both, then Harris is 4 points ahead, which is impressive, and the Democrats would take that any day of the week, but it is a little bit less than what Biden beat Trump by looking at the popular vote in 2020. And finally, if Harris is at like the peak of her like possibilities, if she's above 51 and Trump is sitting at like the medium range of like 45, she's ahead by almost 6 points. And that is a very, very solid win for her if it happens, which I'm very skeptical of. So it seems pretty much agreed, based on all the numbers that they're putting into this thing, that Harris is going to win the popular vote, which anyone could have guessed, really, but the margin of error is more than 3.5%. So we could either look at Harris winning by 2.2 or as much as 5.8. So what does that look like for the map? Well, I figured I won't go with The Economist there because, honestly, I think these numbers are pretty good for Harris, and I almost felt like they were too optimistic in a way. So I went to Real Clear Politics, which is a, let's say, pretty conservative-leaning side of the internet, as it were. They don't really count polls where Harris is above 33 in any of their averages. And I believe that if any state poll results in a tie, they attribute it as a win for Trump in their projections. So looking at Real Clear Politics, looking at all of their state polling, state by state, basically going to their no toss-up section, just like whoever is ahead, but no matter by how much, put it in. What does the map look like? Well, the electoral map looks like this. You can't get that much closer than that. Now, a big part of this that I wanted to touch on was that New York Times did quite a bit of polling in the Sun Belt states, as it were, so not counting Nevada, but looking at Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina. And they released a poll recently, or rather a collection of polls that showed Trump in a pretty good position in the South, at least. So while Harris is still the favorite, and she has some quite favorable polling recently coming out of the Midwest up in the north, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, it seems that these areas are sort of slipping away from her a little bit. If you look at the New York Times and their averages in these polls, it looks like North Carolina is within the margin of error, Georgia barely, and Arizona looks like almost a lost cause. And of course, this is just one poll, but this is a very highly rated pollster. I will say, though, very quickly that about North Carolina, this New York Times Senate poll was conducted for over the course of about 5 days. And in the middle of that, Mark Robinson, the Republican candidate for governor of North Carolina, was involved in that enormous, internet history leak. And if you don't know what that's about, go watch my last video. It's a bit much to cover very quickly. But awful controversies for the Republicans aside, we won't know how that has impacted the race until we really get some more polling out of North Carolina. So for the time being, this really is the race. And I also want to make note, looking at Nebraska, it does look like Harris will most likely pick up an electoral college vote there because of their unique system. There was a lot of drama, and I even covered it a couple of days ago about how Republicans were trying to reform North Carolina's laws at the last minute to make it so that whoever won the state as a whole would win all the electoral votes, effectively taking one vote away from the Democrats. The Republicans more or less needed every member of the Nebraska state legislature to agree with them to make this last-minute change, but one member who used to be a Democrat but then switched to Republican basically said no, he wouldn't go along with it. Now, this is almost certainly because he has plans to run for the mayor of Omaha, and taking away the one electoral vote that Omaha gets for itself would be a pretty bad way to start your political career at a citywide level. But regardless of his intentions, as it were, Harris is now going to get that extra vote, it looks like, from Nebraska. So this is the map. Well, this is the map for now. I mean, if we know one thing about this election, this whole 2024 cycle, it's that seemingly anything can happen. And who knows, in the next news cycle or as late as October, maybe some story comes through and this becomes completely irrelevant.